Okay, can the folks on the line see the screen?
Yes, we can.
Excellent.
Yes.
And Bobby, are you able to do you have control, or can you see, do you want me to kind of click through as you do in the intro before we switch it over?
Yeah, Ben, that would be great if you could just control it on your end.
Sure. Yeah, so maybe I'll click in here. I'll do a quick intro. So for the folks on the line, thanks for joining. Thanks for taking an hour out of the weeks. We know that you guys have busy schedules and other things obviously on your plate, in addition to integrating with the Open Checkbook. A little background on me. My name is Ben Strakowski. I have been working with the Commonwealth on various Open Checkbook and IT-related projects for about 4.5 years in various capacities. So I typically serve as the tech lead for this. When files break or you get error warnings or other things, I'm typically the point person for those types of things. And then we also have Bobby, who you guys are probably a bit more familiar with. I'll let him introduce himself, and he's going to go ahead then and kick off the slides today and then hand over to me for some more technical information. So thanks again for joining and taking time out of your day to talk to the materials with us.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Ben. Yeah, so again, my name is Bobby Weinstein. I had the chance, hopefully, to meet most of you on the line at Friday's kickoff. And just as a little background on us, we're, as you know, on Wave 3, so we've had the chance to work now with 7 authorities in onboarding to the Open Checkbook. And, typically with our process, we try to offer 2 training webinars during the very initial week or second week of onboarding to help authorities understand, right off the bat, the data requirements and, systems that will be so essential for submitting payments and payroll data to the Open Checkbook as you work through onboarding. And so today's webinar is focused on the data file specifications, which will be for both payments data as well as payroll data. We also have included pensions specs in this document that was provided to you in the data file specifications document. And, just to reiterate, on pensions data, this is something that will be optional for authorities. It's not required by the statute that is guiding our efforts here. So really today we'll be focusing on payments and payroll as a result. And so Ben, just to take it over to the next slide for the goals of today's session. So we have a few specific points that we want to introduce you guys to. One is to give you a sense for the file specifications document. We're going to be working back and forth between the webinar slides and that document during this presentation. And again, this is a document that, as you're still starting to get just initially familiar with, we realize it will be a lot up front, but we hope that with both today's webinar as well as the status call and data meetings that are planned shortly after this month, that you'll start to get more and more acquainted with this document that will be so important for how to structure your payments and payroll data. We'll also cover today what's called the flat file transmission process, and this is basically a way of examining how to prepare a data file to be submitted to our server for upload onto the dashboards that authorities use to view how their data will look like as they work towards the appearance for how the live site would show their data. So we'll speak about that in some detail. We'll also cover different issues and questions that authorities could run into as you begin developing your data files, including category mapping. We'll provide another view of the top-level spending categories that was mentioned at Friday's kickoff, and we've included a little more detail for that section just based on feedback we got from the Friday kickoff as well. And we'll also cover in a little bit the contextual information that is also part of the data that is submitted by an authority to the Open Checkbook. And then finally, we'll also cover tips for how to prepare for the data meetings and status calls that we have planned for each authority a little later this month. And Ben, I think that covers it. I can pass it back over to you.
Great. Great. Thanks, Bobby. So really, Bobby kind of teed it up here, but the Excel file that we're going to walk through today has 3 tabs on it. The first really outlines kind of procedural things, so things that, as far as the process involved with submitting files, general structure of the file, any kind of iterative things with regard to the actual kind of content within the files, not as it relates to specific data elements, but more of how the transactions relate to each other, how we capture history, how we categorize things. That's kind of in that first tab. The second tab really talks through the the second and third tabs, and if we get to pensions, the final tab talks through the actual individual data elements. So that really gets into, okay, here are the individual required data elements that comprises each file. What's the format for each of those data elements? What's expected? What could be potential pitfalls if data is coming in incorrectly or the way that our system is not expecting it. We've designed the system to incorporate multiple dozens of authorities. So some of the requirements in there may seem somewhat either generic or in some cases fairly specific. The reasons for some of that are because we are trying to kind of encompass requirements from all sorts of different sizes and shapes of authorities out there and make a system that can incorporate various types of data. So we'll talk through how that affects your data files and the structure and content of the data that comes in on those files as it relates to the system that we built. Any questions on that approach before I jump in? Okay, great.
And Ben, Ben, I'll just add one last point to everyone on the line. Feel free, of course, through this entire presentation to chime in with any questions as they come to you for Ben or for myself, as we work through these slides.
Yep. And so what we have here is this is kind of just a bookend to what we're going to dive into. This is the general format of the files. So what we've asked is that authorities send with their payments and payroll files. It's a pipe delimited file. I know we have kind of text delimited on here, but I should clarify, it's a text file that is pipe delimited. So I don't know if the authorities have the tech folks in the room, but essentially that just means that if you have this data that's being captured in a source system, such as PeopleSoft or QuickBooks, or maybe you use Great Plains, I think some of the oldest systems sometimes use Lawson AP or other types of systems. A lot of times those systems tend to kick data out either in spreadsheet form or they do have ability to kick things out in delimited form. So if you have things like if it's coming out as a comma delimited or if it's coming out in a different format, we can work with you to show you different ways of getting it converted into a pipe delimited form. We've asked that the files don't have header rows in them, and we can talk in more detail about that. But this is kind of a precursor to the way that the files will typically work. They'll typically come out of a source system largely in some sort of a spreadsheet form, or if not, convert directly to a pipe delimited. From a process perspective, this is really the general overarching process as far as how you would submit your files. So as I had alluded to earlier, you either can kind of do this process manually. So if you have, an IT administrator or someone similar who's working with your source systems to export this data, you can export that data to, say, Excel. You can convert. We have documents on how to convert the Excel to a pipe delimited. It's very simple. And then that pipe delimited file, that's how you would create the pipe delimited file in the first option. With the second option, for more advanced systems, some authorities have set up automated processes that automatically export the data, either directly into a pipe delimited format or some other type of format that they then automatically convert it. But in either case, that file will then convert into a pipe delimited file, as we had shown in the previous slide. The Commonwealth uses a vendor called, or I believe it's a software called Interchange. And so what that is it's basically a facilitative service that basically accepts files from external entities and then pushes those files into our systems, where our system then picks up the file and loads it into the open checkbook. What that means for the authorities typically is that you would download an SFTP client. Do you have a question? You would download an SFTP client similar to like a WinSCP. There's various types of SCP clients out there. It's basically, for the non-tech folks in the room, it's just a small application that lives on your desktop. You can typically drag and drop your files onto a pane, and then that pane kicks it over into, points it at our interchange service. We have set up accounts for all the authorities on the call that we'll be sending out in the next few weeks that will allow you to point at interchange, and then interchange will push it to our system. So kind of in short, it's a two-part process of creating the file. I guess it's a multi-part process of creating the files in your source systems or exporting them out of your source systems, converting them into the proper format, and then transferring those files via our interchange service into the Open Checkbook. So procedurally, that's typically how the process works. We've worked with many authorities over the last about 9 to 12 months with various types of source systems and various types of technical limitations or challenges on a wide variety of issues regarding this process. So that's definitely why we're here, to help kind of facilitate any unique technical challenges and things you guys have with regard to your data as we work through it. Are there any questions on that process? Okay. So again, more procedurally, this is how the transmission frequency will work. There is really two phases to the Open Checkbook. The first is this kind of 13-week or so. I know some of the authorities are in a slightly different time frame, but period where you guys will be sending files as often as you need to. So the system is designed, we have a test environment or a test kind of playground where your IT folks can send these payments or payroll files to. And that environment is meant to be able to handle files all the time. So as you're testing files, as you're iterating over files, you can send those files as kind of quickly as within an hour. So our system will pick up the files every hour, load them onto the Open Checkbook dashboards, where you can then see what your authority's data would look like in those dashboards when it's kind of ready for prime time. And we have built these systems for you guys to use them, and you'll have your own login credentials and things to use the system over the next 13 weeks or so as you're testing and validating data. A simple example is, the authority creates the data file, they send it over, maybe part of the file loads correctly and part of it fails. You would go into the dashboard and say, oh, okay, we have, 500 records that loaded. I don't see the rest in there. Let's delete it back out when there's a facility for you to delete out that data that you previously loaded. We have an application that we're going to talk about in a different webinar that allows you to delete out previously loaded files, and then you can reload it. So that's really the 13-week. It's a very quickly, high cycle, iterative process where you're sending and testing files in the Open Checkbook and making sure that it is, kind of to what you're expecting. Once we move beyond that 13 weeks, we'll move into a monthly cycle. This gets into some of the statute requirements where the transparency statute indicates that the data should be refreshed within 30 days. So we typically ask that authorities send files every month. So this is once we become stable, the authority is comfortable with the data, content and structure and how it's expected to be shown, then you're just going to be sending us iterative updates to your data on a monthly basis. So this is just, okay, June has passed, we are now going to send you our June data, and then you would send that June data by the end of the month. And so that's really what these first bullet points are really talking here. A part of the onboarding process, as I had mentioned in that first 13 weeks, is also establishing the kind of final state of your historical data. So one of the main goals as you are onboarding over this 13-week period is to iterate over these payments and payroll transactions to the point where you have now sent us kind of 2010 through current data that you have historically, and then we just manage that or store that data in our system, and then once you're kind of done onboarding, that's data that you no longer have to provide unless there's some issue or something that needs to be changed from a historical perspective going forward. So that's one of the other goals of the onboarding process. And this is what we'll work with you guys to do to load over the next handful of weeks here. And then, as I had mentioned earlier, we do support deleting of this data both by a file, so you can delete out, okay, I sent file XYZ, I want to delete that back out. But you can also delete by a full fiscal year. So you can go in and say, I want to delete out just 2012 or 2011. So those few notes on the transmission frequency and process with how the files are typically sent. Are there any questions on that stuff? Okay. And so a few notes on the actual structure of the processing. And so let me just see here where we're at within the file transmission. So maybe what we'll do is, before I jump into the flat file data management, I'll kick over to the actual file specifications doc here so the folks on the line can get familiar with the actual requirements, and then I think a lot of this will make a bit more sense within that context. So if you notice here, we pull open. So this right here, and let me know if you can't see this file, you should see an Excel spreadsheet in front of you. And on the bottom, you'll notice how we have a handful of tabs. As I mentioned earlier, the first tab is a high-level specifications document. So this document really goes through, you'll notice there's 3 sections on here, payments, payroll, and pensions data. And each of those is basically a requirement that outlines either something procedurally about the file, what either the cycle is or how the processing works. A lot of it I've highlighted already in the deck today, but it really highlights the kind of details of the formatting and process. So, for example, if you look at, say, I won't drain this, but payments number 1.4. So we list in here as different naming standards, for example. So this would be the naming standard that you would send your payments, payroll, and pensions data in a certain standard, and that's the standard that our system is expecting to pick it up at. It talks about historical loading, so how far back we're expecting the data to come in as, changes, and we'll talk a little bit about the changes to the different files. So this is change management. So for example, if you were to create and I'll talk about this in the detailed payment specs here, but if you were to send a payment that you realize needs to be voided, then there's ways of handling how to net that voided record back out of the system, things like that. Payment status, different action types for different transactions, data elements that are required. So how are we maintaining uniqueness across records, change management, redactions, and I'll highlight these in a little bit more of a summary level in later parts of the slides as best practices. But this is really kind of a document that you can use to look up individual requirements for the files themselves. So that's for payments, payroll here as well, and then we have pensions down at the bottom, which is not required by the statute. So we'll have to see, how many of the authorities are planning on providing that data. The second tab here is the actual payment spec itself. So what we've done is this is the list of all the field names and their associated descriptions with the field names. And we've added which fields are required. So you'll notice how we have, and I'll walk through these kind of briefly here in a minute, but what the field type is, the length, whether it's required, and then a typical example that we've tried to give either from other authorities that have provided us data or from the state. So, for example, the first is the authority code. This is a very important field. This is the code that, as we've set up your authority accounts, we've given you kind of a system code. This is not a code that we're really displaying anywhere on the dashboards. It's more of a code that maintains, MSBA separate from MBTA, separate from PREM, etc. Your authority name, that should be pretty straightforward. The authority fiscal year and fiscal period. So this may be, 3, 4, and 5 kind of actually go together in a way. There's also the payment date in there. The payment date may be separate from the fiscal period and fiscal year, depending on when that payment was actually allocated or adjusted for in your accounting system. So you may have a payment that went out the door, in June, but it doesn't actually get applied through the accounting system until July of the previous fiscal year or the subsequent fiscal year. We've allowed you to maintain them as separate here. So you can put in a payment date, say, for June 5th, but it can apply to a fiscal period that's associated with July. So that's why we've wanted to make a note of that, but that's a separate piece to that. Funding types, so these would be, here we go. In the state's example, this would be like operating capital or trust. These are not required fields. They do show up in some of our detailed pages, but they'll default to unspecified if you guys cannot provide them. So this would be the funding type of the payment or the spending amount. The account, so this is either account or the appropriation, typically sourced from your accounting system. So an account number would be, 1234, depending on the source system you're using, the account name. These vary a bit depending on if you're using, QuickBooks or PeopleSoft or whatever it might be. But those are typically account information that comes out of your source system. Department code, so for larger authorities, so there's kind of three cases that could happen here for departments. For the really big authorities, typically there is some sort of a departmental hierarchy, kind of going top down. So we've asked for the bigger authorities to flatten that departmental hierarchy and give us just a singular list of departments that they think most appropriately represents their data. And that's what they would put in here for those department codes. Department names, the department name, same thing. That is actually a required field. And then for the authorities that have singular department lists, that's great. If you just have a list of departments within your authority, then you would just send us that list. If you're a very small authority and you don't have departments, I believe Best Ventures was an example of that in a previous wave, then we just ask that you default in your authority code and authority name here.
Yeah, thanks.
Questions on that? Okay. Spending categories. So we have in here that the state provides a list of high-level spending categories. Later in the deck, we have a few slides on our recommendations for high-level spending categories and how that works. But essentially, we have there's actually three main ways that you can categorize your spending data. If you look at the bottom here, we actually have a field called spending type, which kind of ties into the spending category as well. But essentially what will happen is if you take a look at all of your transactions for your authority, the Open Checkbook supports the display and representation of three main types of spending. The first is actual just payments data. The second is loans, and the third is grants. So typically authorities will go through and say, okay, do we have a lot of payments data or loans data and grants data, and they categorize those accordingly, and that's displayed here in number 29, which is the spending type. Then within each of those types, this is where we get back into the spending categories, you can provide a list of high-level spending categories that the state has provided kind of a starter list for. You don't have to follow this list, kind of one by one if there are categories in there that you don't think are applicable, or if there are additional categories that you think are appropriate to your authority that the state has not captured, then you're welcome to add those. But essentially under each type, of whether it's a payment, a loan, or a grant, you can choose to use these high-level spending categories to categorize your data. We've tried to keep these somewhat standardized so that, down the road, if we want to provide, kind of cross-quasi, comparisons, or if we want to provide summary-level data about all the quasis or the authorities, these high-level spending categories will, having a standard set of high-level spending categories is helpful for that. These spending subcategories, conversely, can be defined completely by your authority. So these are the low-level categorizations of your data, kind of as it comes out of the accounting system. So a lot of authorities have chosen to use their actual account information for this. So some have chosen to reuse their account names for their categorization pools. Others have created their own. You kind of have an option there. But this is what we'll show in the actual drill downs of the dashboards as users are drilling through the high-level spending categories down to low-level categories, which then go down to the individual vendors or recipients of your loans or grants or payments data. So that's fields 13 and 14. 15, 16, 17, 18, and 19, actually all the way down to 23. This is all your recipient data. So these are your vendor codes or recipient codes, names, any aliases they may have. They're headquartered in city and state and zip, which may be different than their actual, the city, state, and zip that they're receiving payments from. So an example would be if, vendor ABC who is headquartered in Boston but may receive their checks, somewhere else in Massachusetts, then that's where there's a difference between 18, 19, and 20, and 21, 22, and 23. So these fields, as you notice, are not required. They are helpful in some of our more detailed pages where you can search by, okay, what are the recipients by towns or states. 24 is the export date. So this is the date that your data has been exported from the system. This is super helpful. This shows up in the dashboard as your as of date. So, typically users will have asked in the past, what is this data as of? So what's the latest data set that MBTA or MSBA has provided to the system? It's helpful for them to see that. So that's what that field is. Payment ID. Payment ID is really a largely internal tool that we use to test data and help you guys facilitate the testing and troubleshooting of your data. If your source system captures payment IDs as they come out of the system, then it's super helpful to provide it because it provides a single source of truth for a record that we're trying to track down or something we're trying to troubleshoot. If your source system does not, and you can't provide it, that's okay. We can use the combination of the other fields that you provided to maintain uniqueness. Typically what we'll do is we'll use the combination of the required fields to maintain the uniqueness of a record. And so that's what payment ID is there for. Spending amount. Spending amount is the actual amount spent payment to or loan or grant to the recipient. There is one note on this. It's a little bit touchy with the formatting on the spending amount. So you'll notice how we've added in some notes about the specific format that the system is expecting for the spending amount. Recipient suppression flag. We'll get into this a little bit later, but we allow authorities to, and any external data that comes into the Commonwealth, the ability to either A, not send transactions that are deemed sensitive. So if a record is, for legal reasons or security reasons cannot be exported out of your system, we support you just not sending that. So, if there's a recipient that is particularly sensitive for a particular reason, and you cannot send the entire record, then you just don't send the record, and that's okay. The second is if there is data that is only appropriate to show at a summary level. So this would be maybe a vendor that is sensitive to show in the open checkbook, but at the same time you still want to represent the overall spending of your authority at a higher level. So maybe within that spending subcategory or spending category, that's where the recipient suppression flag comes in. Basically just flag the record as vendorless. We'll maintain that record in our high-level aggregations to show, okay, you spent $5 million in, services for this year or something like that. But you may only have $4 million of which are shown at the very vendor detail level. So it's a way of showing the most accurate way, the most accurate representation of your aggregate quasi data without having to show the actual vendor information for each one of those records. Payment status. Payment status, again, we'll talk about this a little bit later in the slides, but payment status is a way of tracking the life cycle of payments data or spending data as it moves through your system. So this is, say you have a transaction that goes out the door and it goes out as a paid transaction. It was paid to vendor ABC, and then you realize that the payment was incorrect or it needs to be changed and you need to void it. Since we may be having as I alluded to earlier, we have incremental data that we're receiving every month. It makes it somewhat challenging to go back to previous months and go and void old records and things like that. So what we ask is that you just send an offsetting transaction in the current month file. So a lot of source systems typically work this way, where you have, payment 1 from last month that went out as paid, and then you have you match all those same payment identifiers, but then you list it as voided, for the negative $100, and the system will net those out. If they net out to 0, the system will filter the net of those two records out completely. If they net out to some, netted record of say $50, then it'll show the net of $50. So that's a way of us tracking the kind of life cycle of the payment as it goes through the system. And then spending type I had talked about earlier. This is your very high-level categorization of the spending data as it moves through our system. And then action type, for most of you, the action type is going to be I for insert. We do support deletes and updates. This is a way for you to automatically force the system to update or delete something, but typically we haven't really used it much. It's typically just defaulted to I. So I know that's a lot of information. I'll pause there. Are there any questions on the structure or content, things that were required or not required, the approach to certain fields, any of those types of things with regard to payments data? Okay. If you don't have any questions, we have added a tab here as well for some sample payments data. So this is a file that we received, I believe, from META. It has sample data in here that you guys can see, excuse me, where you can see the years, periods, dates, all the funding type information, and all the other things that typically export out of the system, and what that really means and how it's going to look when it comes out of the system. So you can look at that. Bobby will be distributing this information over the next few weeks as well. And a quick reminder again on the payments data, again, this data is incremental. So over the next 13 weeks, we'll be working with you to send this data over and capture the historical component, and then we'll work with you to establish a process for sending over monthly data, which is different from the authority payroll data. So before we jump into payroll, let me just see here. Let's just highlight a few things on the spending. So as I noted, spending is incrementally loaded. You provide your historical data, and then your ongoing data is provided in monthly increments. The authorities then manage that data across files with the payment status field. This field is meant to track payment through time. So as I just noted, that was the example I gave about paid transactions and then netting out with void transactions, or etc. One other note, the one thing I didn't cover on this slide on the bottom here is the emergency request. So we do also support, if you send a transaction in a prior year's file or a prior period's file that is very sensitive and needs to be immediately removed, you can submit a production support request, and we can go ahead and remove that manually automatically, or right away. So that's just another fail-safe that we have for previous year's data. Jumping into payroll data. Payroll data is managed from a procedural perspective a bit differently than the payments data. The payroll data is not incrementally loaded. So, well, not really incrementally loaded. So the way that the payroll data works is there has been a bit of sensitivity over the last year working with authorities to maintain internal identifiers for employee data. So what we ask is that the authorities actually manage a master file of all of their payroll data internally within their authority. So what it means is, as a contrast to payments data where we're receiving incremental monthly files, with payroll data, you would export your payroll data, historical payroll data, and then as the months go through time, you would append the latest month's payroll data to your master file that you're managing internally at the authority, and then you resend the full master file every month. And the reason why we have to do it this way is because otherwise we have to maintain consistency across months, and then that's required in the past. Us maintaining things like internal employee IDs and other pieces of very sensitive information that didn't make sense to be managed on the Commonwealth side. And so that's why we came to an agreement on having the payroll data largely be managed on the authority side. And again, we can work with you over the next handful of weeks here to establish a process for that. Excuse me. Jumping over to, and that's what the notes kind of highlight here. The payroll spec. Payroll data is a bit more simplistic than the payments data. For one, you're not sending incremental data, so there's no need to track kind of transactions through time as they relate to the open checkbook. That's all kind of managed internally before it gets sent over. Some of these data fields are slightly different. The authority code is the same, however. The authority name is pretty straightforward. It does run off the calendar year, so as opposed to the payments data that runs off the fiscal year, the authority data runs off calendar year. And it also has a payroll data as of. So this may be slightly different than the actual export date. So in the payroll file, we've provided two separate fields to capture kind of date and time. This payroll date as of captures the actual last pay period for an employee. So that's more of, okay, we've sent you a file June 1st, but it's only containing payroll cycle data as of the second week in May. And so that allows you to show that the payroll, year-to-date payroll values and things like that are very specific to the actual payroll date that they were kicked out of the system, as opposed to when the file was actually submitted. The employee ID. So this is, we have this as required. I know I just noted earlier about how we don't capture employee identification numbers. What this is just a sequence that we ask that you provide. It's not the actual internal employee IDs. Most IT admins or folks that are working with the payroll data create some sort of a sequence or something that just maintains dummy numbers for their employees in this file. So again, it's not meant by any means to be anything that can identify an employee. And then a few obvious fields here: last name, first name, middle name of the employee job title and job code. The job title is required, so this would be their latest job title. Job code, some source systems capture a job code, not just a job title, so if you have that information, that's helpful as well. And then also department code and department name. So this would be the employee's currently assigned department code and or name. It follows the same standard as the department list for the payments data. Again, we ask that you flatten your department list, but the payroll department list can be separate from the payments department list if for whatever reason you need to track them or maintain them separately. Most authorities maintain one master list and then kick it off to both files, but some have maintained them separately. One note on the actual level of detail of this data: we do not capture cyclical payroll cycle data, so we're not capturing anything at the detailed levels of biweekly or weekly or monthly accrual cycles or any of that. We ask that the level of detail is actually rolled up to the required fields here. So what that means is you'll be providing, for an employee, for a job title, for a department, for a given calendar year, they'll get a year-to-date payroll, aggregated payroll value, which is a summation of all of their payroll cycles year-to-date for the current year. And then for previous years, that would be a summation of all the payroll they received for that year. And that's what's represented in the payroll amount. So we have some notes in here. The cumulative payroll earnings for a calendar year. For the current year, this represents a year-to-date value. We did it this way, the state didn't feel like they needed to capture the data at a level lower than this. And also with the various different payroll cycles across, multiple authorities, it did make sense to try and capture any kind of cyclical payroll cycles and instead show them at an aggregate value. And so that's how the data level or the level of detail for that file works. There's also a listed salary. We only ask that the authorities provide this for the current year. We don't ask for previous salaries for previous years. It's only for the active year. If it is easier for you to send salaries for all years, we automatically clear that data out for previous years. and then the export date. So this is the actual date that's exported out of the system, which may or may not be the same as the actual payroll date. You'll notice some of these fields are required. That's typically what we use to maintain the uniqueness of a record. One note is we do, and this is in the first tab of this document, if an employee department changes throughout the year, we maintain 2 records. So that means that if you're searching for employee ABC, the first 6 months of the year they may have department A, and the second 6 or however many months are left in the year they may have department B. So it maintains the historical transition between departments, but it does only show their latest job title. And so there's a few reasons why we designed it that way, largely driven by kind of previous authority work that we've been doing. But we can work through those details as you start to create your payroll file. Questions on the payroll file?
How far do we have to go to, is it a year?
I believe the payroll data goes back to calendar year 2010.
2010.
2010, calendar year 2010, as opposed to the payments data, which I believe is back to fiscal year 2010.
Okay. And then okay, so for every year, just submit their amount. Don't break it down to all the payroll, or, for example, for 2010, 2011, 2013, can I just give you guys or put just one amount, or do I have to break it down by payroll date still?
You can, great question. So you can, what we would typically receive, say you had an employee that was, employed for all those years, they would have, if they hadn't changed job titles or departments, we'd get one record for them for each year, what their cumulative payroll was, an aggregate of all their cycles for that year. And then, we would aggregate it, and then what you would send for the payroll data as of would be the latest, date that's close to today's date, whatever we're showing. So you don't have to maintain a payroll data as of for all those prior years.
Okay.
Because it's assumed that, the year is closed, and the payroll data really is to show the current year stuff. That makes sense?
Yeah.
Any other questions on the payroll data? I know it's quite a bit of information.
So I know that the required field are, for example, for us, we don't have an employee job code. So that's not necessary because I see it's not labeled as required, correct?
That's right.
Okay.
I have a question
Yep.
as well. I don't
Sure.
know that historically, if I'm going to be able to determine changes in department and title over the previous years.
Yeah, so we've had that question a few times in the past. Of course, in an ideal world, we'd be able to track, kind of the history of as employees, go throughout their departmental changes or job changes throughout time. But of course, we understand if, you guys are only maintaining, whatever their latest department was for that year, that's okay too. So if you only have one singular department listed in 2010 for an employee, then that's what the data is. So there's really no way for us to, kind of change that.
Yeah, I don't think I can map old departments and old job titles with payroll for that far back.
Okay.
So I can just use their
so that
current
should be
title
fine.
or the last title I had on record and last department code I had on record for each employee.
That's right. Yep. Yes, I mean, the spirit is, to provide as much detail as we can, but, of course, there are data limitations and technical limitations with the data itself. So whatever you have listed as the most relevant and appropriate job title in the department for that employee within that year is fine. Other questions on the payroll data? Payroll data has tended to be the slightly more simple or a bit more simple file to create, but tends to be a bit more, as you can probably guess, contentious with getting it perfect. So we definitely are aware of that and focused on making sure we can support you guys if you have questions on it. Any other questions? If no other questions, we created a sample file. So again, here's some MBTA sample payroll data you can use to get started, and you'll have that for your reference. I'm not going to go through pensions in detail. We're running a little short on time, so but you'll have it. The only thing I'd note on pensions is, I'm definitely not the legal guy at the Commonwealth, but some authorities have mulled over providing pensions, even though it's not required, because we have seen some, it'd be somewhat beneficial if we get IT resources aligned within the authority to just kick out pensions data in the case that the Commonwealth does ask for this data in the future. So that'd be the only thing to think about, if you guys are anticipating that the new statute may come in and require pensions data in the future. It might be helpful to use these guides and things to start to think about what those files would look like. We have built the Open Checkbook to support it, but it's not required. So I'm not going to go over it in detail today, but feel free to ask us questions on, kind of what that structure is, or if you guys are mulling over potentially creating something in place for future pensions work or even current pensions work. Definitely let us know and we can help you with that. So that'd be the only note I wanted to add on pensions. Any other questions on the file spec in general?
So again, on payroll, we're doing just the gross year to date, right?
That's right.
The gross amount, right? Okay.
For the current year, yeah, that's correct. And then you also, for the current
Yeah.
year, have that listed salary amount.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, so I know we only got 10 minutes. I'm going to try and kind of cruise through these last slides here. I think I've talked about interchange. This you can refer to this slide if you have questions on the interchange stuff. But essentially, you work with your IT admin to get a simple client set up. We do ask that interchange can tend to take a little bit of time to get kind of going. So if you do even have blank files, you haven't created any data yet, and you want to just send a blank file via interchange to make sure that works so we can get ahead of any security or architectural issues, that's great. We'll be sending over those interchange credentials pretty soon here. Bobby will be your contact after that, and I can help as well. So, sorry about that. So then we have, so that's the only last note on interchange. The high-level spending categories, I spoke about this earlier. Again, it kind of goes top-down. You basically look at all of your transactional data across payments, loans, and grants, and then you let that filter down into the actual high-level spending categories. So you say, okay, within payments, now we have these, 2,000 transactions in payments. Now we're going to categorize these by these high-level spending categories. One note on that, we don't have as detailed kind of best practices or recommended top-level categorizations for loans and grants. Reason B is in the previous phases of the Open Checkbook, we've only provided payments data. So the state hasn't built out a kind of a robust set of, recommended categories within grants and loans. So those are really more for the authorities to kind of, you have your own, you can dictate what you want to categorize those as. So we've had various types of loans, high-level categorizing, and grants, high-level data categorizations. So that's just the one note on that, why you might not see these high-level spending categories for the other ones. You can reuse them. So if you feel like, highway and building projects, you make a lot of loans within that category, you can still categorize your loans data that way. And obviously, we'd encourage that to reuse the categories as much as possible. And then subcategories is you have full discretion to categorize your data at that low level as you see fit. Questions on that for the high level categories? I know it's a little bit confusing as far as how we've kind of landed on that.
Yeah, Ben, I can jump in here. This is, again, Bobby from ANF. Folks, just to reiterate a couple points there. So, again, these top-level categories, as Ben had mentioned, our goal in having consistency with our authorities using these is to help users, in the future especially, have either a comparison to utilize for specific categories at the top level, or to at least help us with aggregating, how much spending potentially is, going to very specific, purposes. And so, that's been our starting point for these recommended categories. Another thought that we may have not fully covered in the Friday kickoff is that with the subcategories, those can really be built off of your account names in your source data. Really, the exercise of mapping this is deciding which accounts make the most sense for which top-level categories. And so those account names that you most likely currently have in your source data already can just be repurposed into subcategories for the Open Checkbook. And so we hope that that can provide an efficiency here that we may have not fully made clear on Friday. And just one final point is if you look to Ben, if you could just click on to slide 12. So the next slide, we've provided definitions for each of the recommended top-level spending categories. And following the kickoff, a couple folks asked about whether these definitions, number one, whether they were exclusive in that, whatever is defined by these definitions, can other types of payments or, purposes for payments fall under these categories. And of course, for us, these definitions are intended as guidance. And so what we've provided is simply a sense for what could fall under administrative expenses, for example, or facility and operational costs. And as you peruse your data, each authority has the discretion to decide, what else should belong in these categories as they see fit. So please, as you go through these definitions, treat them as guidance, and also recognize that you will have the opportunity to create unique descriptions for both the top-level categories as well as the subcategories that you use. And that's all. Any other questions on this front from the group? Okay, and just to wrap up on this particular section of the deck, as Ben clicked over here onto slide 14, you'll see that, again, for grants and loans, we will speak about this further, most likely on the status calls or data meetings that we have scheduled with each authority. And that's when we can get more into the details of, specific grant programs or loan programs that your organization pursues, and whether it makes sense for those to be a top-level category for grants and loans, for example, or whether to use just a generic type of top-level categories such as grants and subsidies and loans. We can discuss those types of choices with you at the data meeting, as well as sort of the overall categorization, scheme to this project. So I'll kick it back to Ben.
Cool. So if there's no other questions on that, I think that this best practices review is just that. It should be review. I think we've hit these topics, kind of throughout the slides. This is more of a kind of a reference for you guys. The first is the organizational structure. This is really the departmental list. So if, like I said earlier, if you have larger departmental organization structures, we ask that you flatten those, and if you don't have any, then we ask that you default your authority data in there. We can talk to them more as we work with you guys individually. Data redactions, I spoke about those two types, right, where we have summary transactions that are only shown at an aggregate level, and then we also have data records that you just don't submit to us at all. Summary transactions, that kind of ties into the data redactions as well, and I think we covered most of that in previous slides, and then I think that should be the most of it for this slide. I know I highlighted that pretty quickly, but I do believe we've talked about most of this in the deck. So quick recap, we talked about the file specs, field definitions, so what are the forms, or what are the fields, what are their formats, what's required, what's not, some examples of data that other authorities have provided. The file transmission process and frequency, so the big differences there are what are we doing in the next 13 weeks to test and load and kind of iterate over files. What are we doing versus what are we doing, kind of after 13 weeks on a monthly cycle to manage and support this. Historical versus monthly data sets. So again, the next 13 weeks we'll be focusing largely on getting your historical data in, and then we'll talk about a process for managing monthly data. SFTP configuration. So this is going to be typically your IT folks in your organization setting up a connection to our servers. Should be pretty straightforward, and we encourage you guys to get started on that sooner rather than later in case there are any snags with security or architectural issues. Data categorization, this is where you'll be working largely with your business owners to determine the most appropriate representation of your data, both at an aggregate level and at a detailed level. Not really a technical task, more of a business task to make sure that your data is most appropriately represented. Data redactions, those two types, either data that you don't send to us or data that you would need to submit a request to have redacted as kind of an emergency request. And then summary transactions, which is the data that is only partially shown. So we're not showing the recipient data here. We're just showing these at aggregate levels in the dashboard screens. So that's what we've recapped today. We have obviously status meetings with individually with each of you over the next few weeks to talk through issues and kind of risks and those things. And we can definitely field any questions we have during those. Feel free to reach out with questions over email if you have any immediate pressing stuff that comes up, or kind of red flags that you saw in this presentation that you're worried about are deal breakers to kind of getting this work done. Definitely feel free to reach out to Bobby and or I earlier in the process so we kind of can be aware of those and mitigate as necessary. And I think he probably has a next steps here. Oh, Bobby, do you want to talk about the timeline here at all?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Ben. So folks, thanks again for joining today's webinar and for your time this morning. As you'll see on the timeline, so again, this week, some of our goals are, of course, finding out from you the business and technical leads that will be, driving this project over the next 13 weeks. We've covered the file specs webinar today, and just looking a bit down, we'll be doing the configuration portal webinar on Thursday. Again, both of these webinars are being recorded and then posted to our project website. So we'll be providing information. It's actually on the last slide of this deck as to where to find those recordings on the site. So the URL will be included at the final slide of this deck. And in terms of the spending categories and contextual information activities, again, we encourage folks to, take what you're learning from both the kickoff and today, to start looking at those particular activities. We'll be honing in on both of those with our status calls that are scheduled for next week. And specifically trying to find out with you what timeline would be, acceptable and practical, given the many other, pressures that we found out you guys are also dealing with, during this time. So we'll be honing in on that next week. And if we just can then just push it to slide 18, that's our upcoming meeting slide. So invites for the weekly individual status calls as well as the configuration portal webinar will be going out very soon. And with those invites, I know we found out from certain authorities that the times that we suggested may not work for you. So when you receive those invites, use that as an opportunity to let us know other potential times on those days that could work for you. We'd be happy to realign our schedules with what works for you. And looking to the last week of July is when we'll be targeting the data meetings, which will be an opportunity to really go into much more detail regarding categorization, regarding data sensitivities, choices regarding redactions, and many of the things that we've covered today. And if we could just then take it to slide 19, our last slide of the deck. And again, so on the slide, you'll see the authority support site is www.mass.gov/ANF/quasi-transparency. That is our slide that is our URL where we will be posting this recording today as well as Thursday's webinar. And, coming out of both this meeting and moving ahead, feel free to be in touch with me or with Ben with any questions, coming out of these webinars. So thanks again, folks, and we look forward to speaking with you again on Thursday. And have a good one.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks all.
Thanks. All right, thanks all. Bye-bye.